Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The point of my book, I suppose, is that every single one of us tells stories. We tell stories when we apply for a job. We call it a curriculum vitae, or we tell stories when we go for a job interview. We tell stories if you run a business. When you go into a bank and say, please give me some money because I need to expand my business, you tell a story about yourself, you tell a story about your business. Every one of us does that. Leaders just do it a bit better than the rest of us. And they do it in a more organized fashion. And while there are many qualities that leaders have to have, and there are many different qualities depending upon the type of leadership, decision-making, creativity, and so on, the one key feature of every leader, at least every leader I've ever met, is to be able to tell a story in order to have followers, because without followers, you're not much of a leader, are you? So just to give you a couple of examples, what I call leadership stories. These are just very brief headlines where the leader writes a headline for journalists like me, but also it becomes what Germans call an Ohrwurm, an earwig that gets in your ear, like that pop song that you don't actually like very much, but you can't forget it. Mrs. Thatcher said she was the grocer's daughter from Grantham. Tony Blair said, I'm a pretty straight sort of guy. Nelson Mandela, there's different methods of telling stories. For instance, Nelson Mandela, when he was tried in an apartheid court, he chose to turn up at the court wearing traditional Xhosa dress. Now, this wasn't because that was the wardrobe opportunity of that morning. He was telling a story about who he was, an African leader in a white man's court and going to be railroaded in injustice. I also talk about what I call, anyway, counter-stories and pre-stories. The counter-stories are the stories that your enemies tell about you, and the pre-stories are the kind of judgments we make about a leader or a person we're about to meet before we meet them. Journalists are particularly prone to the pre-stories. You might call them prejudices as well. Mrs. Thatcher, the grocer's daughter from Grantham, was also known as Mrs. Thatcher Milk Snatcher. And there was a great counter-story about her put about by the Russians, that she was the Iron Lady. And I cannot think what it must have been like in Downing Street when they found out that the Soviet communists were calling Mrs. Thatcher the Iron Lady. Thank you very much for doing my storytelling for me. I'm sure she must have thought of. Bill Clinton, the first time I met him, and I know the first time a number of other people met him, during the conversation he slipped in that he was just a boy from Hope, meaning Hope, Arkansas. What a brilliant little story that was. Only slightly undermined by the fact that much of his growing up was also done in Hot Springs, which is a gambling town in Arkansas, which isn't quite the same. But the story was there. Leaders, like novelists or Hollywood scriptwriters, have one particular technique which I find very interesting. I call it the violation of expectations. Well, let's put in your mind a picture of Steve Jobs launching any product that you can think of. You know exactly how he's dressed. He's wearing an open-neck shirt, no jacket, he's wearing some scruffy jeans and some trainers that look as if they could have been cleaned before he got on the stage. And compare that to the kind of story that Bill Gates told. He was often very buttoned up when he made any of his media appearances. Now, what you got from Steve Jobs is, I'm not a corporate kind of guy. I'm a cool kind of geek, while he was running one of the biggest corporations in the world. It was a brilliant storytelling act, in my view. One of the things that interests me is the vocabulary that leaders use. About 20 years ago, Newt Gingrich, who was an unsuccessful presidential candidate this time, wrote in the early 90s, privately for Republican candidates, very, very interesting advice for them to use the words that they should use when talking about themselves, and also words that they should use when talking about their opponents. Here's Gingrich's list of what he called optimistic governing words. Candid, care, challenge, children, courage, debate, dream, environment, family, hard work, legacy, liberty, and so on. For your opponent, here's the all-purpose Newt Gingrich vocabulary. Bureaucracy, cheat, collapse, corrupt, cynicism, decay, destroy, destructive, failure. And in the document, Gingrich is not saying Republicans stand for the following policies, because policies have got nothing to do with it. It's got to do with a vocabulary that you can use to create a particular type of impression. And we realize that these words have got no particular value. They're just words of abuse or words that are supposed to make you think well of the person using these stories or telling the stories in that way. I also try to explain the power of pictures. The one leader whose leadership team really got this right was Ronald Reagan. When Reagan had to make a big policy announcement about the environment, and let's agree that his credentials on the environment were not that of the Green Party, what they would do is put him in an open neck shirt, stick him on a horse, and put him in a canyon somewhere in the western United States. Now, he could have been announcing that he was concreting over Grand Canyon or turning it into a cement factory, but the pictures tell you another story. There's this good-looking older guy on a horse in the American West, and the American West was the star of that story. Essentially, I think there are three leadership stories that all the leaders I've come across tell. The who am I story as a person. I'm the Iron Lady, I'm the boy from Hope. The who are we story, which could be we're the new Democrats, we're different from the bad old Democrats, or we're compassionate conservatives, or whatever it is. That's a story about who we are as a group. And the final part is, where is my leadership going to take us? What is our common purpose? One thing which has certainly changed is that we have become a much more confessional culture. The media has changed since 1989, I think, very profoundly. And I say 1989 because the fall of the wall seemed to herald in all kinds of changes that we haven't really quite assessed yet. What happened during the last election was I was sitting in front of the TV watching Alistair Darling being interviewed by Piers Morgan. And here we have the Chancellor of the United Kingdom during the worst economic crisis of our lifetime being asked by Piers Morgan, and I quote, "Are you good in bed?" A subject which had not occurred to me. Nick Clegg was asked how many lovers he had. David Cameron was asked by a newspaper when he conceived his youngest child, whether he'd ever committed adultery. Gordon Brown was asked about family tragedies and so on. And I started thinking, there's Barack Obama, who published an autobiography where he talked about his drug use as a young man. Tony Blair's wife, Cherie, talking about when the youngest child was conceived. And I thought, can you imagine Winston Churchill being asked any of these questions? Winston, do you drink too much to be Prime Minister? You can't, can you? It's completely inconceivable. So what has changed? And that got me thinking about the nature of the media, the nature of the stories that leaders now think they have to tell, because that's what people will ask them about, and whether they really do have to tell these stories, or whether they could say, hold on a minute, why are you asking me that? It's got nothing to do with my job. I want to leave you with a couple of stories about Ronald Reagan, which I find quite interesting, because he was a great storyteller publicly, but also a leader's image is partly the image of storytelling in his inner circle, the stories that people tell behind the president's back or the prime minister's back, and which may change your views of that person. One which was told to me by Michael Deaver is that at a great moment of crisis, Ronald Reagan, who had a somewhat relaxed view of the working day, would tend to turn up about 9 o'clock in the morning in the Oval Office from the living quarters, which were 2 minutes walk away, and put in a couple of hours, might have a little nap, and then tend to go off in the middle of the afternoon. He came in one morning with his dog, which was described to me by Deaver as an untrained mutt, and all these big barons, really, of the Reagan administration. There were some really big egos in that administration, quite extraordinary characters, had been meeting through the night to decide what to do about the foreign policy crisis. 9 o'clock, the president walks in, dog runs round and round and round in the Oval Office. And one person, who gave her name to me, but I think I should keep quiet about, said, "Mr. President, one day that dog is going to piss on your desk." And Ronald Reagan said, "Everyone else does." Those of us who are interested in policy, and I'm sure the people in this room are, do pay attention to the bits that interest you. But all of us think we get character, and we get character pretty much through stories. And some of those stories are shaped, these ones were private ones, but Reagan, if you remember, after he was shot, he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck," to his wife. That was actually a quote from Gene Tunney, a boxer who got knocked out in the ring. So the stories that he told and that people told me about him and about other presidents and prime ministers don't occur like pieces of gold naturally in the landscape. They are manufactured, and they're manufactured for a public purpose, which is generally to make you think well of the leader. Thank you.
Most of the examples you give do come from the West, particularly the US, but also the UK. And that's partly about your own experience. But as global power and leadership certainly without doubt moves east from the Atlantic to the Pacific, if you like, but also hopefully moves south, might that have an impact and an influence on leadership and the way storytelling happens through that leadership?
Deng Xiaoping is an amazing leader of China, and he, among other things, his Urwurm, his earwig, would be socialism with Chinese characteristics, which he said repeatedly. That's a brilliant phrase, given that he'd been purged a couple of times from the Communist Party. I mean, what's he saying there? He's saying anything you like about socialism, well, I'm still that, but anything you don't like, well, I'm something different. There are a series of storytelling things that he did which helped build modern China. They're very simple. I mean, he was very famous for saying it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the rat. So he's saying, I'm not going to pursue the ideological path of Chairman Mao. I'm going to pursue a pragmatic path, and every Chinese peasant is going to get it, because we all know about cats and rats. I'm not one of those who think that, sometime in the next 2 years, China will rule the world. I think China's got lots of other problems. But there'll be different methods of storytelling appropriate for a Chinese audience. And I suspect it will certainly not be through official channels, because the Chinese do things somewhat differently.
Some of the skills and qualities you described feel that they are needed for all of us, whether we are official leaders or not. And I just wonder whether you think there's anything more our or other education systems can do to develop skills for storytelling and also for critical analysis of other people's stories within our schools and beyond.
Because part of it, as you know, I mean, I've tried to break it down into leadership lessons. Those of us who, if you want to lead in your business, if you're a deputy head teacher and you want to be a head teacher, what stories should you tell? How should you impress people about the good things about yourself? And we all do it. But the other thing I wanted to try to do was deconstruct how leaders do it, so we can be, I'm not suggesting more cynical about it, but I am suggesting more critical of the kind of stuff that we are fed by the media or through the media, and deconstruct it. And so therefore, to teach that in schools, to teach people, to get people to look critically at what they see on television in schools, wouldn't be, to me, a soft class. Nor would it be a soft class to read a newspaper and say, what does it actually mean when it says, friends of Joe say, what does that mean? It probably means they've made it up, is my view.